In the mid-2000s, the NBA expanded the league by adding a team to Charlotte to replace the franchise that just relocated to New Orleans, thus birthing the Charlotte Bobcats. Now, just like most new franchises, of course, you had your struggles, your ups and downs. However, when it comes to the Charlotte Bobcats / Hornets, this is an organization that has struggled significantly over the past 15 years. So much so that it's actually concerning, because if you know anything about the NBA, there are several ways that a team can systematically change their fortune. So personally, when I see a franchise like Charlotte be as bad as it has been for the past 10 to 15 years, of course, some eyebrows have to be raised. And while doing research, I had to figure out what exactly has this organization done with all of their draft picks. Because since 2004, the Charlotte Bobcats / Hornets have had over 20 first-round picks, 10 of which have been top 10 selections. So how is it that this organization has been struggling this much for this long? But before we dive deep into these draft selections, I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who has supported this channel over the past few years, because we have finally hit 200,000 subscribers. Also, thank you to everyone out there who has supported me on my second channel, because we're already at 10,000 subscribers, and be on the lookout for my first upload because it will be coming out in the next few days. And if you're one of the people who are still hesitant to subscribe to my second channel because you don't know what type of content I will be uploading, me and a good friend of mine, Waleed, sat down and reacted to a video on YouTube, and it's on his channel, and I'll put that link in the description. Do me a favor, after this video, go to his channel, watch that video, and if you enjoy that type of content, then you'll know for a fact that you will enjoy my second channel. So with all of that out of the way, let's get right into the video. So first we begin in the infamous 2006 draft, and after a terrible regular season from the Charlotte Bobcats, they are awarded with the 3rd overall pick. And with it, they decided to select Adam Morrison, a 6'8" forward out of Gonzaga who was coming off of such an impressive junior year that he was drawing comparisons to Larry Bird. Yes, the Larry Bird. Unfortunately, not only did Morrison fall extremely short from those expectations, but also he was out of the league just 4 years later, making him one of the biggest busts in recent memory. But even with that title, it's still really hard to be hypercritical of this draft selection. Because looking at what was available after Adam Morrison, the 2006 draft, just to be honest with you, really wasn't that talented. Being realistic, the two best options that were still available for the Bobcats were either Rudy Gay, who was a fringe all-star, and Brandon Roy, who had superstar potential but was never able to fulfill it thanks to injuries that he sustained all throughout his career. So yes, a bust, but a very explainable draft pick in my opinion. And a very similar sentiment honestly can be had for next year's draft class as well, because thanks to a trade that occurred a few months prior, as well as another really bad season, the Charlotte Bobcats went into the 2007 draft with 2 first-round picks, the later one being a 22nd overall pick, and with it they decided to draft Jared Dudley. Now, I could nitpick this selection and point out that Wilson Chandler was still available. However, Jared Dudley is a solid role player who's had a very long career in the NBA, and finding that type of value that late in the first round is pretty impressive, so I'm not going to really nitpick it. And then when it comes to the top pick, the Charlotte Bobcats owned the 8th overall selection. With it, they decided to draft Brandon Wright, who they traded immediately on draft night to the Golden State Warriors. Now, one could be critical and point out the fact that Joakim Noah was still available, who at his peak was an elite level defender who won Defensive Player of the Year. However, putting things into context, at the time, the Bobcats believed that Emeka Okafor was going to be their franchise player, especially since he was coming off of the best season of his career. Furthermore, Charlotte received some pretty valuable assets in return for Brandon Wright and Jamario Davidson and Jason Richardson. But in 2008, it's a different story. Again, thanks to a trade as well as another bad season, the Charlotte Bobcats entered the draft with 2 first-rounders. The first one being a 9th overall pick, and the front office was divided on who they should select. On one hand, you had some execs who believed that they should draft Brook Lopez, as Lopez was more of a scoring big and Okafor was able to counterbalance that with his defensive presence. But then on the other hand, you had some people in the front office believing that they should draft DJ Augustin, the loudest person in this bunch being Larry Brown, who was the head coach for the Charlotte Bobcats at the time. And he would get his way, as the Bobcats would draft the 5'11" point guard with the 9th overall pick in 2008. Unfortunately, this didn't work out for the organization, as Augustine turned out to be a bench player, while Brook Lopez at his peak was an all-star, and is still relevant in today's league as he has evolved his game to be more of a floor spacer. But wait, it gets worse, because later on the draft night, the Charlotte Bobcats decided to trade their 2010 first round pick to receive the 20th overall pick. The reason for this is because they believed that Ajinça was too good to pass up on. The problem with this, though, is not only did they just give up a first round pick, as well as Ajinça being a mediocre player in the NBA, but also all of the players who were selected immediately after, such as Ryan Anderson, George Hill, Nicholas Batum, and Serge Ibaka, not only turned out to be better players, but also would have been better fits for the roster. Moving on to the 2009 draft, and even though the Bobcats have seen some improvement, it's still not enough to take them out of the lottery. So with the 12th overall pick, the Bobcats decided to draft Gerald Henderson, a 6'5" shooting guard who should provide some floor spacing that is desperately needed on his team, but never really panned out to be nothing more than just a solid backup. But to be fair, looking at some of the other players who were drafted right after, such as Tyler Hansbrough, Earl Clark, and Austin Daye, honestly, Henderson might have actually been the best available prospect for the Bobcats. Luckily, by the end of the 2010 season, the Bobcats were a playoff team, so the pick that they traded to position themselves to draft Ajinça really didn't turn out to be that valuable. And actually, it was the 16th overall pick, and with it, the Minnesota Timberwolves decided to select Luke Babbitt. However, within the next year, some huge changes would occur with the roster, because in the middle of the 2010-2011 season, it was clear that the Bobcats had capped out, and their ceiling was, at best, a first-round exit. Because of this, they decided to part ways with Gerald Wallace, who at the time was undeniably the best player on their team, and traded him to the Portland Trail Blazers, and in return received some valuable assets, the two most noteworthy ones being 2 first-round picks, one in 2011 and one in 2014. So now entering the 2011 draft, the Bobcats have 2 first-rounders. The first one, they decided to select Kemba Walker, who had a somewhat slow start in the NBA, but really turned around his career in the last 5 seasons and has become a perennial all-star, made an all-NBA team, and for what it's worth, he was the face of the franchise in Charlotte. And with the second first-round pick that the Bobcats again received during the Gerald Wallace trade, Charlotte decided to draft Tobias Harris, who has turned out to be a fringe all-star in the NBA, or at worst, an above-average starter in this league. Unfortunately, though, the progress that was seen from Harris to get to that point wasn't while he was wearing a Bobcats jersey, because Charlotte decided to trade him on draft night to the Milwaukee Bucks as a part of a 3-team trade. In return, Charlotte would receive Corey Maggette and Bismack Biyombo, who was the 7th overall pick in the same draft class. Unfortunately, though, neither one of those players were able to come close to what Tobias Harris was able to produce in the upcoming years. But honestly, that wasn't Charlotte's main concern, because during that trade, the Bobcats also lost Stephen Jackson, who was the 2nd best player on the team by far, and the reason why they wanted to do this is to tank for a potentially generational talented player in Anthony Davis in the upcoming draft. The result of this was a 7-win season from the 2011-2012 Charlotte Bobcats, making them not only the worst team in franchise history, but also one of the worst teams the league has ever offered. So why didn't Charlotte draft Anthony Davis? Well, it's because they lost the lottery. Yes, even though Charlotte had one of the worst records in NBA history, they still lost the lottery to New Orleans and only received the 2nd overall pick. And with it, in the 2012 draft, they decided to select Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, who had some potential entering the NBA with his athleticism hopefully transitioning to elite level defense, but that never transpired, and honestly, he has turned out to be one of the biggest busts that the league has seen due to his inability to space out the floor. To make matters worse, there were an abundance of talented players that were still available, such as Andre Drummond, Harrison Barnes, and Bradley Beal, that would have been great fits alongside the young roster that Charlotte was attempting to build at the time. Next, we have the 2013 draft, and thanks to another mediocre season from the Bobcats, they have yet again another top 5 draft pick at their disposal. With it, they decide to go with Cody Zeller, a 7-foot big man out of Indiana, who honestly hasn't really panned out to be anything special in this league. However, to be fair, when it comes to the 2013 draft class, it is a bit weird to try to project how some of these players are going to pan out to be. So even though, yes, sure, Giannis was still available, at the time, no one really expected Giannis to turn out to be the type of player he is today. So me expecting him to be drafted with a top 4 pick is a bit excessive. But then again, you still have some floor spaces out there, such as Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and CJ McCollum, but I will give some slack to Charlotte this time just because how weird the talent structure was in 2013. But I cannot do that for 2014, as the 2014 draft class was viewed as potentially one of the most talented classes the league has ever offered. And this time, Charlotte had 2 first-rounders, again thanks to the Gerald Wallace trade that gave them the 24th overall selection, and they also had the 9th overall pick as well. Now, let's pause for a second and let's look at the roster so you can understand how bad of a selection Charlotte makes with the 9th overall pick. In last year's offseason, the Charlotte Bobcats decided to sign Al Jefferson, who is a big man who cannot space out the floor, but is definitely a key component to this team's success so far. Also, be very mindful that this team just drafted Cody Zeller, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, and traded Tobias Harris for Bismack Biyombo. So it's very clear that the front court has more than enough players, and if you're going to add someone in the front court, it definitely needs to be someone who has the ability to space out the floor. So with the 9th overall pick, who do the Charlotte Bobcats select? Noah Vonleh, a 6'10" big man out of Indiana who cannot space out the floor, even though players such as Dario Saric, TJ Warren, and Zach LaVine are all still available. But wait, it still gets worse, because with the 24th overall pick, again that they received from the Gerald Wallace trade from Portland, Charlotte decided to go with Shabazz Napier, but then traded him on draft night to Miami for PJ Harrison. Now, neither one of these players have turned out to be anything special. However, still available on the draft board was Bogdan Bogdanovic, who has turned out to be a quality player in the NBA who has the ability to space out the floor, something that this team desperately needs. But wait, it still gets worse, because during the 2015 draft, and I'm being very serious when I say this, the Charlotte Hornets do something so negligible that I'm actually flabbergasted how poorly mismanaged this asset is when it comes with the 9th overall selection. So again, Charlotte has a mediocre season, receives a lottery pick, and it turns out to be the 9th overall selection. Now let's all pause for a second and put things into context here. Charlotte just got done drafting Noah Vonleh, Cody Zeller, Tobias Harris, and trading him for Bismack Biyombo, as well as Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, and also 2 summers ago signed Al Jefferson. So again, the front court is filled with players who cannot space out the floor. Furthermore, the backcourt is looking a bit suspect, as Gerald Henderson hasn't really panned out to be the starting caliber player that they all hoped he would become. So you would assume that this is a team that will go after a shooting guard, or at least someone who can help space out the floor. But no, because for the 3rd straight season, the Hornets decided to draft another big man who cannot space out the floor in Frank Kaminsky, who has not only turned out to be a mediocre player at best, but also looking at some of the other players that were still available, such as Justice Winslow, Miles Turner, and Devin Booker. Yeah, just a terrible decision from Charlotte. But wait, it still gets much worse, because before the draft, Danny Ainge, general manager for the Boston Celtics, offered a trade package to Charlotte that quite honestly should have been unrefusable, as Ainge was willing to give up 4 first-round picks for the 9th overall selection. Now, how valuable were these draft picks? Well, 2 of them were going to be in the same draft class and turned out to be the 15th and 16th overall pick, which turned out to be Kelly Oubre and Terry Rozier. Another pick was going to be a future Minnesota Timberwolves or Memphis Grizzlies pick. And then finally, the Hornets would have the ability to pick one of the 2 future Brooklyn Nets pick, which at the time was one of the most valuable draft picks that were available, as everyone knew the Brooklyn Nets were going to be one of the worst teams in the NBA, which meant that those picks were going to translate to one of the top 3 picks in the upcoming drafts. But wait, it still somehow gets worse, because when prompted the question on why exactly the organization declined the offer, Hornets Vice Chairman Curtis Polk argued that having those extra picks would have created a roster crunch after acquiring players such as Nicholas Batum, Spencer Hawes, and Jeremy Lamb during draft night. Mind you, that this is a team that has an abundance of big men and just drafted another big man in Frank Kaminsky. So all of a sudden, a roster crunch is a problem? Just doesn't make any sense to me. But then he continues by saying, and I quote, "Even if someone wants to give me first round picks, what am I going to do with them?" So after the 2016 season, the Hornets make the playoffs and they receive the 22nd overall pick, draft Malachi Richardson, but then trade him to the Sacramento Kings for Marco Bellinelli. Nothing really extravagant there. But then after the 2017 season, the Charlotte Hornets are back to being a mediocre, subpar, non-playoff team, so they received the 11th overall pick. And mind you, during the lottery, the Brooklyn Nets pick that they potentially could have had turned out to be the first overall pick. With it, the Boston Celtics decided to trade down with the Philadelphia 76ers and draft Jason Tatum with the 3rd overall selection, a move that the Charlotte Hornets clearly could have done since, you know, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist really hasn't panned out and his team still needs some floor spacing. However, Charlotte still has the 11th overall pick. So who did they select with it? Malik Monk, who was supposed to come into the NBA as an explosive combo guard who had the ability to space out the floor and finish strong at the rim. However, his career really hasn't panned out for various reasons, and some of the players that were still available on the board, such as Luke Kennard and Donovan Mitchell, who also played a shooting guard position, would have been better fits for this team. And then finally, we have the 2018 draft, and after another mediocre season, the Hornets have another lottery pick, and with it, they decide to select Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's turned out to be a really good player in this league who has a lot of promise and upside, and in my opinion, at bare minimum, he will be an all-star in this league. Unfortunately, none of that promise will be seen in Charlotte as the Hornets decided to trade him on draft night to the Los Angeles Clippers and in return receive Miles Bridges, who also shows some potential, but not to the same level as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. To make it even worse, this is an organization that knew for a fact within a year's time they had to make a decision on Kemba Walker, and when they made that decision, they didn't even offer him a max contract and basically allowed him to walk in free agency. So instead of just drafting and keeping Kemba Walker's successor and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, they decided to just let both of them walk, and the two players that they received in return, again, is Miles Bridges and Terry Rozier. Just doesn't make any sense, people, whatsoever. And quite honestly, that is a huge reason why I don't believe in this whole concept of small markets being at this unfair or massive disadvantage. To a certain extent, there is some validity to that argument. However, when you go back and you look at a lot of the decisions that a team like Charlotte has made over the past 15 years, it is undeniable the amount of talent, potential trades, and assets. I really don't feel sorry that this is an organization that has struggled this much for this long. But with all that being said, people, please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. Also, make sure you click all the links in the description, click the subscribe button, notification bell, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.